parable of the wheat and the tares. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. Jesus presented a parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The servants of the landowner came out and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The servants said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No, for while you are gathering the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will tell the reapers, first gather up the tares, and bind them in bundles, and burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" Once again, we have a story of sowing seed, but this time the landowner is central to the storyline. The man's servants sow his field with good seed. Then while the servants were sleeping overnight, the enemy enters into the land and begins to sabotage the field. The enemy of the landowner sowed tares in the same field alongside the wheat plants. In the Greek, the word for tare means darnel. A darnel is a type of European ryegrass, and when darnel first sprouts, it looks exactly like new shoots of wheat. Obviously, the enemy of the landowner wanted to ruin the man's crop by sowing confusion, literally. By planting grass in the field, the enemy wanted to introduce competition for resources, leading to a reduction in the crop. The grass growing next to the wheat would rob the wheat of water and nutrients from the field to choke it off. It reminds us of the third condition in an earlier parable, the sower and the seed. So they asked the landowner, how could this be so? That is, how could there be bad plants coming up in the master's good field? The master explains that the enemy had entered into the field at night to sow the tares. So the servants offered to go out and remove the bad plants from the field. But the master quickly objects, reminding the servants that the tares are identical to the wheat. The master said the servants would inevitably make mistakes. They might pull up the wrong plant, which would only further reduce the master's production of wheat. The landowner was willing to let the tares share the field for a time, though it may reduce production somewhat. At least every wheat plant survives, and in that time, the tares and the wheat would be clearly known. At harvest time, the wheat plants would mature to the point of producing seed, but the grass never would. So at the time of the harvest, the wheat plants can be easily identified, taken out of the field and preserved in the master's barn, while the tares will be removed and burned. If you will remember in the parable of the sower and the seed, Jesus says that the kingdom program may be compared to sowing the field with good seed. So based on these parables, we can already see that the kingdom program will be a program of sowing, growing, and harvesting. In literal terms, it is a program of recruiting new citizens for the kingdom by sowing the word of the kingdom or gospel. And that program will be opposed by many powerful enemies intent on limiting the production. Like the parable of the sower and the seed, Jesus' disciples couldn't fully understand this parable, so they asked Jesus for an explanation in private. That request comes in verse 36, and it is followed by Jesus' interpretation. But before that moment, Jesus gives us two more parables to build on his teaching of sowing and growing. So let's look at those additional parables before making sense of this one. Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 33. He presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. And this is smaller than other seeds. But when it is full grown, it is larger than any other garden plants, and almost becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches." He spoke another parable to them. "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened." In verse 31, Jesus sticks with this agricultural motif, but this time it's a mustard plant. Mustard is an herb, and there are a variety of mustards in the world. The kind of mustard native to the Middle East grows considerably taller than any other herb. It towers as much as 10 feet tall, which makes a mustard plant like a tree compared to any other garden herbs. It's so large that the birds will make a nest in its branches. But the seed of the mustard plant is quite small, about the size of a BB, and that's the contrast between the mustard seed's modest beginning and its impressive finish that form Jesus' focus. The mustard plant's small to great transformation characterizes an aspect of the kingdom, but which aspect? Once again, it's not immediately clear what Jesus is saying here. Jesus teaches a companion parable in verse 33 to help us understand his point. He says the kingdom can be prepared to leaven or yeast that a woman hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was completely leavened. The scene here is very different than the previous 3 parables, but the contrast is similar. Yeast is a microscopic plant. When it is activated by the warmth and moisture of the dough, it begins to reproduce. As it does, it gives off carbon dioxide gas, causing dough to expand and rise. Eventually, the yeast reaches to every part of the dough, causing the entire lump to rise. So what was small and initially hidden soon spread to every corner and made its presence known. So like the mustard plant, this parable starts with something small, insignificant, and almost invisible. And like the mustard plant, we end up with a disproportionately large outcome in the end. As the yeast spreads to every part of the dough, it causes all of it to rise, thereby making its presence known. So we have 3 parables about the nature of the kingdom program. The meaning of each may not be perfectly clear, though we may think that we know what Jesus is talking about, and perhaps we do. But if so, it is probably because we have 2,000 years of history helping us to make sense of them. But imagine yourself in the disciples' shoes. To say nothing of the crowds, they were mystified. And again, it was intentional. Jesus repeats in the next short passage, Matthew chapter 13, 34 and 35. All these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables, and he did not speak to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the foundation of the world. As I mentioned in the parable of the sower and the seed, Jesus only spoke to the crowds in parables after his rejection. Never again would the crowds hear Jesus declaring spiritual truth in the open. Matthew said this was to fulfill the prophecy spoken in the Psalms, which promised Israel the Lord would come to them speaking parables. Ironically, Jesus spoke to the hard-hearted Israel in parables so that they would not understand the spiritual truth. And yet, speaking in parables was itself another sign to prove to Israel that Jesus was the Messiah. So now let's stitch together the meaning of the parable, beginning with Jesus' explanation of the first. Matthew chapter 13, verses 36 through 39. Then he left the crowds and went into a house, and his disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the tares in the field." And he said, "The one who sows good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels." Here again we see the disciples struggling to follow Jesus' teaching, so they ask for an explanation. And Jesus gladly gives them the answer, which tells us that Jesus wasn't trying to confuse his followers with these stories. He wanted us to understand them, and by the Spirit we can. And as with this first parable, Jesus' explanation begins with the most important detail. In the sower and the seed, Jesus opened with the seed is the Word of God. As that seed falls on hearts around the world, it produces a variety of results. Sometimes it produces new life, other times it won't. Sometimes that new life produces fruit, and sometimes it won't. And now in this parable, Jesus emphasizes that the one who sows is Jesus himself. Specifically, the Lord sows good seed, which are the sons of the kingdom, believers, while the enemy sows bad seed, which is unbelievers. Jesus has taken the focus of his first parable, the sower and the seed, and narrowed it down, especially zooming in to condition 3 and 4. In the sower and the seed, Jesus prepared his disciples to understand that the kingdom program won't reach everyone. And now he's explaining why even among those who receive the gospel, some will not produce fruit. Furthermore, this parable introduces an ideal of a season of time, a period in which the kingdom program will operate on earth. That would be the field. Jesus says that growing must continue uninterrupted until harvest time. And harvest time is a common picture in the Bible of the return of Christ and the judgment he brings to earth. Jesus says in verse 39, the end of this age is represented by the harvest. An age in the Bible is a long time, a finite period of history. An age has a beginning and an end, defined by major world events dictated by God. And as an age comes to an end, a new age will begin. In the book of Daniel and others tell us that our current age will end when Christ returns to earth. And the next age to follow is the age of the literal kingdom of Jesus on earth. So in this parable, Jesus says the harvest represents that moment when he returns to rule and the present age ends. At that time, Jesus says he will direct his angels to harvest, that is, to separate the wheat from the tares in the field. Or in other words, at the end of this age, the believers and unbelievers on earth will be completely separated. For the first time in history, those who are truly God's and those who are not will be fully known, for Christ will make it clear. Notice how Jesus describes that moment. Matthew chapter 13, verses 40 through 43. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned in the fire, so shall it be the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all of the stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. The moment Jesus describes here takes place at the very end of this age, literally as this age is ending and the next begins. At that time, the earth will be in utter turmoil. It will have reached the end of the 7-year period, the supernatural judgments unqualified by anything ever seen by the world. Before that time, the church will have been removed from the earth, and most of those who have remained have died in their judgments. Those who remain will be clearly divided into God's people and the enemy forces, and they will be engaged in a great war, and into the chaotic devastation, the light will appear out of the darkness. Jesus says he returns to the earth in glory, bringing him and his angels, who will carry out his judgments on the unbelieving. Then and only then will the sons of God and the sons of the devil be fully known and separated. But until that time, the two worlds will coexist, and in fact, it may be difficult, if not impossible, to tell them apart. A person's heart can't fully be known. Only by their fruit can we gain a limited understanding of their heart, and the full measure of the fruit will not be evident until the end of the age. In the meantime, these two worlds will mix, but will not find common ground, so spiritual warfare will be the norm. And I'm sure, for Jesus' disciples, this would have been the most surprising revelation in the parable. Put yourself in the shoes of a first-century Jew at this moment. For a Jew, prior to Christ, the spiritual haves and have-nots of the world were always distinct and easily to recognize. Jews were God's people and Gentiles were dogs, they believed, and there was no confusing one for the other. But now, Jesus was saying that God's children and Satan's children would be hard to distinguish. Not only would these two groups be hard to identify within the world, they may even stand side by side in our congregations. In Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Not all who proclaim, 'Lord, Lord,' will be found in heaven." Just as the tares look very much like wheat, at least at first, unbelievers can mimic the claims and behaviors of Christians. But you find the main point of the parable in verse 29, when the master says, "Do not uproot the wheat." Remember, the problem with having tares in the field is that they choke off the production of the wheat, and for that reason, under normal circumstances, a farmer wouldn't hesitate to remove weeds from his field. While he might lose a few wheat plants in the process, the overall effect would be to gain a greater harvest. But in this parable, the master admittedly refuses to allow the servants to remove the weeds. But why? Because the master is unwilling to lose even a single wheat plant. In other words, the master cared more for the life of each of those wheat stalks than he did for the overall production of the field. You and I are those wheat stalks, and Jesus' primary focus in planting the field of the world is to bring each of us into the kingdom. As Jesus said in John chapter 6, verses 37 through 40, "All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will certainly not cast out. For I have come down from heaven, not on my own will, but to do the will of him who sent me. This is the will of him who sent me, that of all that he has given me I will lose nothing, but I will raise it up on the last day. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who beholds the Son and believes in him will have eternal life, and I myself will raise them up on the last day." Jesus is determined not to lose none of those that the Father gives him, and that requires tolerating tares in his field for a time, but one day he will rectify the situation. But in the meantime, It also means that Jesus is willing to tolerate less production, and that returns our focus to the condition 3 Christian as mentioned in the sower and the seed. In that parable, Christians who fail to produce fruit are those distracted and troubled by the world. They are those who are weighed down by the worries, riches, and pleasures of life, and as a result, they neglect their walk with Christ. They fail to devote time and energy to the work of the kingdom, and they don't produce fruit. And now we're learning that these outcomes are a direct result of the schemes of the enemy. He plants bad seeds around us, people who come into our lives, whether personally or indirectly, to create these distractions. The ungodly friend who tempts you into bad habits or routines. The technology guru whose inventions entrap and distract you, stealing your time and money. The Hollywood producer filling your head with vile and lewd images. These are all bad seeds sown by the enemy in hopes of choking off spiritual fruit. But this is a reality of the kingdom program. The enemy works to reduce the Lord's yield. The Lord allows it because he cares for you and he will not lose you. But knowing this truth does not become an excuse for our failure to produce fruit. We cannot turn to Jesus later and claim that the devil made me do it. Rather, I think we will be embarrassed when we realize how little we did to resist these schemes. Don't let the enemy win in your life. Resist him, the Bible says, and he will flee from you. In the meantime, Jesus did not want his disciples to worry that the enemy might gain an upper hand in this fight. He wanted us to know that the enemy will not limit the reach of the kingdom program despite sowing tares in the field. In verse 31, Jesus says the kingdom program will grow much like a mustard seed. At first, this endeavor will seem quite small and insignificant, especially in the face of such determined opposition. After all, if I showed you a mustard seed, who could imagine that much could come from it? And I'm sure the disciples felt very small indeed in the initial days and weeks after Jesus' departure from earth. They were hiding in homes, afraid of challenging the Romans and the Jews, much less Satan and his forces. But in time, the kingdom program has grown like a mustard seed plant, to the point that it towers over the garden. Such will be the progress of the kingdom program despite the enemy's best efforts to stop it. In fact, notice the mustard plant has birds nesting in the branches. We first saw Jesus use a bird in the parable of the sower and the seed, and in that parable, the bird represents Satan. So I believe the imagery is intended to follow here. The birds in the tree are like the tares in the field, and the enemy will try to make a home for himself in the church, but he will not stop the growth. In fact, the church's growth is what invites the enemy to nest in it. Finally, in verse 33, Jesus reminds us of our role in this program. We are called to reproduce so that we might propel growth of the kingdom program. We are the yeast, the leaven that Jesus hid in the world, like the woman hid in her dough. We are insignificant in comparison to the world overall, in the same way that the yeast is an insignificant ingredient compared to the rest of the dough. And we are hidden in the world in the same way the yeast disappears in the dough. Our faith in Jesus is not visible by itself, but we can only be known to the world by the effect we have of our reproduction. Yeast ultimately makes itself known when it starts to reproduce and spread, and as it does, it expands the dough. And soon, no one will miss the effect of the yeast. That's Jesus' call upon our lives, that we be known by our fruit, and our fruit is a seed that results in more production. The enemy will seek to rob us of our time, talent, and treasure, but he will not stop the growth or reach of Jesus' church. But he may stop your growth and reach if you allow it. The kingdom program is a work of service to Jesus. We aren't accountable for the results of the kingdom, but we are accountable for our own fruit. He who has ears, let him hear.